Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone on this overcast Monday to the next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Bethan Davies, who's presenting to us about early interventions for young people to prevent extremism. Dr. Bethan Davies is a research associate at the Security, Crime and Intelligence Innovation Institute at Cardiff University. She is a criminologist whose research interests centre on terrorism, extremism and policing. Beth spends most of her time researching, but she also contributes to teaching at the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. And some of her current projects that she's working on include the government-funded Wales Safeguarding Repository, and she's also exploring social media reactions to terrorism. Beth is actually currently visiting at the University of Waikato. She's visiting our colleague Dr. Lisa Thompson because they are working together on a project developing a mixed method systematic review protocol for looking at interventions of the primary prevention sort to prevent radicalisation, including looking at any potential backfire effects of those strategies. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Beth. Looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, April, and thank you for that lovely introduction. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about some research that I did that actually links really well to the work that I'm working on with Lisa, a colleague at the Institute at the moment. So this presentation is going to focus on practitioners' dilemmas of early interventions for young people to prevent extremism and the action and inaction conundrum that this creates. So in the talk today, I'm going to start with a little bit of background and in this kind of set out some of the policy context because I carried out the study in the UK and in Wales specifically, so just to kind of introduce those issues and then give you a little bit of background about what we know about extremism and young people. Then talk a little bit about interventions and ideas of risk and stigma that have come out in recent years. Then touch on the methodology and a kind of summary of the interventions that I looked at, and then talk a bit about the findings from the research. And there's a few areas there. So first is the conundrum and what that means, and then talk a little bit about practitioners' concerns and the ways that they try and manage those in practice, and then draw to a conclusion. But what I thought I'd start off with is just a kind of introduction, set the scene for some of the definitions that we're working with. And a lot of the definitions on the screen are not really definitions that I necessarily think are the best and that they capture everything, but they just give a really kind of helpful progression from why extremism is seen as linked to terrorism and where radicalisation kind of fits in. So when we talk about radicalisation, what I'm effectively referring to is this process of adopting extreme views that differ from mainstream beliefs and have a strong ideological basis. And one thing about these kind of beliefs is that they're not necessarily a threat, but the idea is that they could lead to terrorism. And then when I'm talking about extremism broadly, I'm referring to opposition to mainstream fundamental social values such as democracy and liberty. Violent extremism, kind of taking that one step further, are the beliefs and actions of individuals who engage in violent acts or support the use of violence to achieve goals that relate to their extremist ideas. And then finally, terrorism. We all know what that is, but it's kind of involves violence, illegal force, political, economic, religious or social goals, and it has an element of fear, coercion and intimidation. And the reason for setting these out in this order is that they are kind of referenced in the literature as being connected, both in policy and academic debate. And the terms are often used interchangeably, but what you can see is a kind of progression from extremist views to violence, to support those views, and then finally terrorism at the one end. And that is kind of broadly, radicalisation is kind of broadly defined as that process that somebody moves through those stages. And I think that's just quite helpful for when we're talking about very early interventions and what they're trying to do, it is to stop this kind of progression. So the UK government, obviously where I carried out the study, the way they talk about it is that we know that terrorism is really a symptom, ideology is the root cause. So that kind of gives you the kind of context for where these interventions emerge. So then, in terms of the policy background that is very specific to England and Wales, I wanted to include this because I know we've got a very mixed audience on the webinar today. But the main thing that a lot of people will be aware of already is the prevent strategy in the UK. And that sits within the broader counter-terrorism strategy, so contest. And that came about in kind of 2004-5, sort of post 9/11, but before we had the London attacks in 2005, so 7/7. And prevent is kind of the main sort of policy in this area, and the broad aim is to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. Now, that's been an incredibly controversial piece of legislation, or a strategy in itself, and the programs that sit within it. And some of the key criticisms include that it's spied on Muslim communities and has created kind of suspect communities because of the ways that, particularly in the earlier iterations of the policy, the way that funding was directed to areas that had quite crudely a high population of Muslims or other ethnic minorities. And that was kind of the way that funding was divided up. And some of the interventions, some of the ways that the rhetoric was used was seen as particularly kind of stigmatizing and creating these kind of suspect communities. But at the same time, despite the controversies, that's been a very influential policy. And traces of it can be seen in different prevention programs globally, so including in the EU. At the same time, the problems with that policy are also cited by some, like the Australian government, as something that they explicitly wanted to avoid when they were developing their strategy. So safe to say the kind of summary there is that prevent still exists and there's lots of interventions that go on and there are lots of supporters, but it's also been a particularly controversial policy and seen as very stigmatizing. Related to that, but kind of sitting a little bit earlier, is you've got the counter-extremism strategy. And the aim of that strategy broadly is to deal with hatred, intolerance and division, and to try and take it out of society, prevent it from coming about, address it early on. And this policy came about because of this view that the government needed to go further to tackle non-violent extremism. So if we think back to the previous slide where you kind of had this progression from extremism to violent extremism to terror, the way that I've laid them out on this slide is kind of the reverse. So you've got prevent dealing with the kind of sharpest end of those ideas, but counter-extremism is trying to deal with some of the underlying kind of intolerances that sit beneath those. And then right on the other end, you've got community cohesion, which broadly kind of looks at trying to work towards common identities, values and trust and good relationships between different groups. And that is seen as playing a role in preventing extremism, because if you can develop that trust and those good relationships, that stops people getting to a point where they are intolerant of other communities. But officially, these kind of areas, and particularly community cohesion, has been kind of sitting separately to the other sort of policy areas. Clearly has links and has lots of values that are relevant, but officially is a kind of different stream of policy. And then in Wales specifically, where I carried out my study, the reason to pull this out is that Wales is in quite a unique position, as I'm sure many of you will know. It's a devolved nation, but in lots of policy areas, there are some overlaps with the UK government, and particularly the UK Home Secretary is responsible for policing in England and Wales together. So while many policy areas, so things like health, education and social care, are powers that are reserved to the Welsh government, things like policing and prevent and the counter-terrorism strategy and the counter-extremism strategy are things that are reserved to the UK government. But the reason for including this slide is that there are some divergences. So safeguarding is a devolved issue or a devolved power in Wales. And that means that they have some kind of differences in the way that they particularly talk about radicalisation of young people. So they talk about this as a children's safeguarding issue explicitly. And sometimes you see language of safeguarding in different UK government policies. But in Wales explicitly, there's this really big emphasis on care and support needs of young people. So there's this really kind of a push towards the response being child-centred and rights-based. And they kind of tend to avoid the kind of language of risk and kind of policing. It's more around what a child or a young person needs in that situation and how they can be supported, which in theory goes against some of the sort of stigmatizing language that we've seen before. And then when it comes to what we know about extremism and young people, so you've got these kind of policy frameworks that sit around the problem, but what we know about the causes of extremism. Some of the concerns around young people's vulnerability or susceptibility to extremism, a lot of the time they'll be linked to identity. And lots of the literature in this area talks about things like a quest for identity. So this idea that a young person who is kind of developing their sense of who they are and where they belong in the world is what makes them vulnerable to extremists, because they're kind of on this quest for identity. And the idea is that extremists almost might offer that to them, and that's what makes them susceptible. And this has also been referred to as an identity crisis. So if someone feels like they're a little bit lost and they don't really know who they are, that they might find that with an extremist group or within a community that shares a set of ideas. And then terrorism is a rare event, obviously, but it's consequential and it's very salient. And when it does happen, it's a huge problem. And you often have the kind of theatrical nature of attacks that might target landmarks or events or busy cities, which make them kind of stick in people's minds. And within that, sometimes you have plots that are being developed by young people. So very close to home in Cardiff a few years ago, we had a young person plan an attack at a concert at the Principality Stadium in the centre of the city. And he was actually arrested on his way to carry out that attack. So that was one that was particularly concerning, and it turned out that that young person was known to agencies beforehand. So they stopped him, but there were questions about what level of support he might have needed. We've also had another young person in England planning to carry out an attack at the Isle of Wight festival. So another kind of big event. And relatively recently, not too far away, we had an attack in Australia by a young person at a church. And those kind of events really do stick in the kind of public and policy consciousness and that kind of mind. And as a result, that interacts with and triggers the kind of policy responses that I touched on at the start. So there's this push to do more and act earlier. And as a result, when you see kind of these kind of attacks that kind of continuously pop up and really stick in the kind of public and policy mind, when you've got some of those that are being organised by young people, you see these kind of earlier interventions start to creep in. And I talk about them as being pre-prevent. And what I mean by that is a sort of set of interventions that happen before someone is vulnerable enough or radicalised enough to go to a government programme, but there's still this view that they need some kind of support. So that's the idea that you can act earlier. And that's where we see a lot of interventions targeting young people and often being delivered in schools. So early interventions, they are something that has grown massively in recent years, not just in the extremism field, but also more broadly in terms of crime and delinquency. But in this particular context, we're talking about interventions that have the aim of avoiding future radicalisation and ultimately terrorism for non-radicalised individuals. And at the moment, extremism has incredibly sort of fuzzy boundaries in the sense that it covers lots of different issues. So interventions are addressing lots of different issues. So you see them really vary from kind of far right, far left, Islamist sort of ideologies, but also starting to deal with conspiracy theories and incel extremism and some other harms, like ways that young people could be exploited and different issues that they might be vulnerable to, almost being pulled into the sort of net of interventions that are trying to deal with extremism. And this is all happening at a time when you've got increasing alarmism around extremism and a push to sort of tackle the root causes of terrorism. And as attacks kind of pop up or plots are foiled, there's this kind of push to say there needs to be more earlier. And that's where these interventions pop in and deal with lots of different issues at once. And in doing that, what an intervention is effectively doing is signifying certain attitudes and behaviours and activities as risky and that they're a concern. But as one criminologist has pointed out, the challenge of this is how you deter the tiny proportion of individuals who will engage in violence without further radicalising the much larger group who experience varying degrees of sympathy for the cause. And that really nicely points to and brings me on to issues of risk and stigma in this space. And this is where the study really kind of focuses. So some of the criticisms and concerns about interventions are that they securitize young people. And there's this idea that young people are seen as both at risk of being targeted by groomers or targeted by people who want them to do things on their behalf. So they're kind of vulnerable and at risk in that sense, but that they're also risky and that they also pose a threat to society. And that kind of treating young people in that way can be really problematic, and that there are potentially harmful and stigmatizing effects of interventions for young people because of this way that they're kind of being positioned. And extremism specific early interventions are quite understudied. So some of the references above are from studies that have looked at interventions for young people more broadly, and we can borrow quite a lot of learning from that because a lot of the themes look quite similar. But when we come to talk about extremism, a lot of research in this area has tended to look at de-radicalisation programs or has focused on prevent policy specifically. But less is known about the earlier interventions to prevent extremism and whether they're really achieving their desired impacts. And there are few exceptions to this, and there are studies that do it, but a lot of them have tended to focus on single interventions that are targeted to one group of young people, and we just don't know that much about them. And another way of kind of imagining what this looks like is if you've got interventions on the one hand, and you've got interventions that are targeting disengagement from terrorism, that's actually quite a narrow audience, and there's a lot fewer people at that point because those are people who've engaged in terror offences. Just below that, you might have interventions that are designed to de-radicalise someone, but again, that's targeting quite a smaller pool of people who already have radicalised ideas. Just below that, you've got interventions that target people who are susceptible to radicalisation. And this kind of susceptible or de-radicalisation space is where prevent policy sits. So studies that look at those types of interventions are often looking at prevent. So that's kind of individualised one-to-one interventions where somebody has, I don't know, expressed something, done something that is actually quite clearly associated with an extremist group, but it's that kind of susceptible language. Then at the very bottom, you've got these very early interventions that sit before that kind of radicalisation threshold. And these have much wider audiences and they're being delivered to many more people. But when you look at the volume of studies, there's actually quite a lot less here. Most of them tend to focus on the kind of programs that happen a bit later. And if they've not studied them directly, then that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the challenges and how you know if they're effective, but we don't really know so much at the early intervention stage. And this is where my study fits in. So the aim broadly of the wider study was to understand the aspirations, organisation and delivery of this prevention work. as well as the way the problem of extremism was being understood. So effectively, because we don't know a lot, that's what I was interested in. So I kind of went in with a really open mind. It was a qualitative study and I used an ethnographic approach. So I did a load of observations. So there were around 40 sessions. It was about 70 hours across 5 different intervention programs. And then I interviewed practitioners and policymakers from different areas. So that included police, teachers, youth, education and specialist support workers. And as I mentioned before, I carried out the study in Wales, and that really helped me to understand some of the interactions between the way that practitioners were kind of framing young people. And then I used Becker's sequential analysis to work through the data and work out what I had. So this is just a very quick snapshot of the interventions that I observed. And starting with the bottom left, what I've called the Harmony programme, that was a programme that schools could opt into to teach the course, and then it was delivered by teachers that were trained to deliver it. And that intervention focused specifically on issues of extremism, radicalisation and prejudice, and was delivered over multiple lessons. Then anti-racism workshops were another school-based intervention that were delivered by charity workers. And that dealt with issues of prejudice, racism, hate crime and Islamophobia. And the kind of assumption was that those were issues that were linked to very early radicalisation. And those sessions were one-off. And then jumping over to the little green circle, so the police lesson, this was delivered to classes in schools by police officers, but not specialist police officers. They were kind of community officers. And that again focused specifically on extremism and radicalisation and was one-off. And those are universal. Those 3 are universal interventions in the sense that they were just delivered to kind of classrooms of young people, not for any particular reason, not because there was any particular risk. They just delivered those sessions and they were quite educational and were meant to give young people a space to ask questions about different issues. Then the Project for Girls at the top in the middle, that was delivered by an ex-police officer and focused on a broader set of issues. So things like online safety and sexism, but also extremism and grooming, but also touched on issues like politics and policing. So trying to, in that intervention, talk about some of the issues that can be the source of sort of grievances which have been linked to extremism. And that was a 10-week programme. And the reason that that is universal / targeted, so if you wanted to think about that in the kind of public health terms, that was primary / secondary. So it was more targeted in the sense that it targeted certain schools where the local authority that was organising the interventions had kind of prevent concerns before, but actually the young people that could attend within those schools, it was kind of open to anyone. And then finally, the Project for Boys in the bottom right was the most targeted programme that I looked at. So that was delivered by specialist youth and support workers and dealt with a massive range of issues. So just a snapshot would be extremism, but also things like county lines, which is a phenomenon we've got in the UK where people are used to kind of transport drugs between bigger cities and smaller towns. So also drugs, gangs, grooming, music, behaviour, law, identity. It was a kind of big range. And that was a 4-week programme, but the sessions were quite long. They were about 2 or 3 hours. And the reason this was targeted was that it was based on what I've kind of termed quite briefly prevent queries. So they're young people, those are a group of boys who were kind of, the staff in the schools had asked questions of the local prevent team and said, we've got concerns because they've made homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic comments, or there'd been kind of fights between pupils. So they'd raised these questions and the prevent team had said, it's not serious enough to be an official prevent referral to the government programme that's very structured, but actually we've got this intervention that can open up the conversation around these issues. And that's where the boys went. So broadly, they were across all of these interventions, it was a range of around 11 to 16 was the age groups that I was looking at. And that brings me on to the findings. So effectively the dilemma of early interventions that are operating in this space. So as well as the ones that I had on the slide before, I also spoke to youth workers and kind of sport support workers that were delivering other interventions. I just didn't get to observe them. So there was a big range of the kind of discussion around different types of interventions. But what really came through strongly was this action and inaction conundrum that practitioners face. And this ties back to their concerns about the impact that it can have on a young person to put them on an intervention like this. So what was kind of the consensus across the board from all the different practitioners was the possibility that young people could be harmed by early interventions and made to feel like bad people. So one example was a member of the local authority team talking about people getting the extremism tag attached to them as a result of referrals to interventions. And this area of concern echoes very well evidenced, the very well evidenced problem that even well-intended interventions can result in harmful and counterproductive outcomes for young people. And there was this kind of consensus across the study that practitioners have a really complex view of their work and what they do and what they're trying to achieve. So another example is that a youth worker talked about interventions loaded with suspicion that could push young people away and towards the communities that shared exactly the views that the interventions were trying to address and pull them away from. So this meant young people could become excluded and disenfranchised, and that has been shown to be a factor that makes them more supportive or more vulnerable to these kind of terrorist grievances. Because if you make a young person feel alienated, that's a huge part of the theory of what makes somebody vulnerable to extremism. So in other words, the interventions then might reinforce exactly the problems that they're trying to solve. And if we think about this in that action and inaction conundrum idea, by taking action and placing young people on an intervention, that risks stigmatizing and labeling them. But at the same time, if you go down the inaction route and you don't do that, you decide not to intervene at all, that could mean that young people don't receive the support they need and that it leaves them exposed to the kind of radicalization risks that we're dealing with. So then, framed another way, interventions can form part of the risk that they're attempting to respond to. So practitioners then have to negotiate the potential harms of both action and inaction. And then the success of an intervention depends on their ability to moderate and mitigate these unintended consequences of negative labeling and stigmatization. So a broader set of concerns, or some of the other examples that I got from practitioners, was one practitioner talking about even when you're trying to help, you can also be harming by kind of cementing and demonizing and criminalizing young people from any background before really they've ever been guilty of anything at all. So this is that idea that, yeah, before they've done anything, you can actually harm them by putting them on an intervention. And another worker talked about having referrals almost like redirected to him. So he said, I had a high volume of referrals because I would take those young people, but I wouldn't criminalize them. And what he was referring to here was having young people referred to him by teachers or maybe other youth workers that in theory maybe should have referred those young people to the official government programme, but they didn't, and they decided to send them to this youth worker because they were so concerned about what would happen to them somewhere else. And that kind of highlights this really interesting tension about what happens in practice and who young people are getting their support from. And then in another example, this green box at the bottom, for a little bit of context, Jade, who I'm talking about in this extract, was a police officer who happened to be observing an intervention with me at the same time. She happened to be in the room. and the intervention was being delivered by one of her colleagues. And she said she felt the content was presented as, if you think this, then you're an extremist or radicalized. And if any of the young people shared those views or any of those thoughts, Jade was concerned that they'd feel bad, like they're a bad person and like they're an extremist. And really interestingly, this particular lesson, I'd spoken to the officer who developed the programme, and the whole idea was that it was going to be this kind of open dialogue, and the content of the intervention would prompt kind of discussion between the young people. But the way it was delivered, whether it was a case of skill or a case of time, was much more kind of, this is wrong, you shouldn't think this, move on to the next kind of section. And it didn't leave much space for conversation. And that concerned the other practitioner that was in the room. And then another different example at the top, the one in the orange box here, Dom was a support worker that I'd watched deliver some sessions in a school. And in this one particular session that we'd been in together, a young person disclosed that they'd been kind of, I guess the term we would use is county lines. So he'd been asked to move some drugs for someone in the local area. And the young person disclosed this in the middle of a session, and it was kind of completely unexpected, but it was obviously a concern. And we spoke to teachers briefly after, and they were aware. But when Dom left the session, he said he was really concerned because he felt that schools were an awkward space for these kind of sessions. He said he worried about young people facing consequences from the teachers if they disclosed things like drug use or extremist ideas. And he didn't want to be responsible for the young people getting in trouble or being punished by their teachers. And this raises some questions about how safe an environment really is for extremism related sessions, especially where there's these kind of disclosures. And this whole thing is that young people are kind of seen as these vulnerable individuals, but there's this concern that that's being kind of linked them to this idea of a dangerous individual, and that can be a really stigmatizing kind of process for young people. And if they disclose something and are kind of punished for it, then that's even more so the case. And another reason that this kind of feeling of being ostracized or excluded is a problem is that if young people feel excluded because their views aren't acceptable, or that they are kind of not accepted by others in the room or by the practitioner, and that makes them reluctant to engage with them, then that creates instant barriers in the kind of interventions that are designed to explore those views and support them. So this is the idea that you need to create an environment where young people can speak openly about their ideas and about potentially their attitudes that might be a concern, but you need a supportive environment to address them. And you need to kind of get the balance right to make that work. But it isn't all kind of massively doom and gloom. So there were some interesting examples about how practitioners tried to deal with this. So this was the idea that if in some cases they might think you shouldn't take action, so you kind of don't intervene, go down the inaction route, because if the intervention is going to be stigmatizing, then don't deliver it. But if they wanted to take action, they had some kind of positive strategies for doing this. So one was storytelling. So using phrases like, I recently read in the paper, I don't know if you heard about this, as a way of presenting a kind of alternative viewpoint. Another, an education worker, talked about challenging the idea, not the person. So if a young person expressed an attitude that was problematic, that they would almost dehumanize it in the sense that take it a step back and just don't challenge that young person directly, talk about the idea a little bit more abstract, just to kind of not put that young person on the spot. And that was all around kind of managing how young people are challenged. And some of the ways that this was talked about was treading relatively carefully, because it's somebody's entire identity, you don't want to erode it. Other examples or ways that this was talked about is development of trust and relationships that will allow the person the opportunity to say things within what you can define as a safe space. And for Steve, the way he kind of talked about himself was, I'm not here to judge you, I'm not here to report you, I'm not here to phone the police. And then a member of the police force that I did some work with talked about young people needing to feel like they're in a safe space to have that conversation with someone without being criminalized for it. And some of the other kind of techniques that were used were the ways that practitioners would acknowledge previous issues in behavior, but then not position them as being entirely representative of someone's identity. So in the extract in the grey box here, the practitioner had been talking about what had happened in the weeks before the intervention. So what had kind of led to the young people being on the intervention. And he said, I don't understand why you're here, you're great young people. And there was this kind of positive reinforcement that came out quite often, and the way that kind of problems or behaviours were framed kind of positively. And this echoes some of the literature, some of the theory around reintegrative shaming. So acknowledging that there might be problematic behaviours in the past, but not only focusing on those, because that's problematic for a young person's identity. So kind of looking back on all of those slides, some concluding thoughts, just some concluding ideas and a summary of what this means. So what I'm effectively pointing at is the risks of both action and inaction when we talk about early interventions, and the kind of conundrum that this makes for practitioners. So this is around whether or not they intervene, and if they do, then they need to manage and mitigate the risks that are associated with that, and sometimes might raise questions about whether an intervention is justified at all, and whether actually it could be more harmful than helpful to draw young people into this kind of net of intervention, and into the kind of system that can often be seen as stigmatizing. And this is helpful and important in terms of what we now understand about early interventions, because this shows us that even at the earliest point of intervention, before there are any clear extremism concerns or any clear extremism or any kind of extremist attitudes, that young people might still be labelled and stigmatised by the interventions, depending on how they're delivered to them. And the negative impact on young people and the counterproductive outcomes of this are an issue. And it's this idea that you're pushing young people towards the kind of ideologies that practitioners were setting out to address in the first place, or kind of damaging their identities in a way that links massively to theories of what makes someone vulnerable to radicalisation. And this has been termed in other contexts as kind of cures that harm. And it's this idea that interventions might be well intended and they might have the potential to be helpful, but it does still expose youth to the sort of system and all the potentially negative consequences. And that's why this needs to be kind of delivered carefully. So for me, some of the next steps are a future project to explore young people's experiences in depth. So a little bit of context to this is that at the time I was doing it, we were coming out of the lockdowns that we had in the UK. And it was just impossible to speak to young people and kind of get consent because we were dipping in and out of lockdown. It was really difficult to kind of find people when it wasn't sort of isolation, and it was just tricky. So what I'd like to do now is follow up on that. But what would be very interesting now is that we're at a stage where we've had multiple wars kind of break out in that time, and we're in a time now where social media is huge, and particularly in the kind of disinformation area. So actually a follow-up study now would be really helpful. So that's my kind of next step. But in terms of turning this sort of data into more sort of policy recommendations, practice implications really, is around how the problem is being framed in interventions. And firstly, that you kind of just need to avoid the sense of making young people feel like they're a bad person. But you also need to make the space for open dialogue. And young people need to feel comfortable sharing their views or asking questions. and being challenged, but in a sort of safe way if needed, in a space that doesn't feel judgmental or like there are really harsh sort of consequences for sharing those views. But as a result of that, you need practitioners who have the confidence to do this work. So there's no point putting someone in front of a group of young people to deliver a session that needs to have a lot of open dialogue if a practitioner doesn't feel comfortable having those conversations. And they are difficult conversations, and that is understandable, but that's just a kind of area of caution there. And that in itself raises questions about who's best placed to deliver those interventions. So you can imagine that maybe a young person wouldn't feel entirely comfortable disclosing some of their maybe activities or behaviours or views to a police officer dressed in uniform at the front of a classroom, but they might feel more comfortable doing that in smaller groups with a youth worker, for example. So I think it's just thinking through those things more carefully when you kind of delivering these interventions, because the risks are very much there. And that is everything from me. So diolch am wrando, thank you for listening. And I will hand over for questions.